So hello, everybody. Welcome to the Mediating Scale conference. For those of you who are just joining now, my name is Oliver Kenny, and I'm delighted to be chairing this panel today. A quick bit of housekeeping. Please note that this session is being recorded. The two papers on this panel will be presented one after the other. Yazdan will be presenting his live, and Sara and Kristian's will be presented as a video, and then they'll be here live afterwards for some questions. And then at the end, we'll have roughly half an hour for a discussion. So please do post your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try and put as many of them as we can to the speakers. Please try to formulate your questions concisely, and don't forget to use the Q&A feature rather than the chat feature. So without further ado, Yazdanmehr Gordanpour is a PhD student in interdisciplinary studies at the University of British Columbia. With a background in English, he is currently working at the intersection of digital, environmental, and energy humanities. His dissertation will focus on the petrocultures of the Okanagan as part of the SSHRC-funded project Kelownafornia, Cultures of Nature in the Okanagan Valley, with principal investigator Greg Garand. I hope I've got the pronunciation correct on those. Today, he's going to be giving a talk on close reading in the age of climate change, scale in interpretive methodologies. So over to you, Yazdan.
Thank you, Oliver. Now let me share my slides. You have them, right? Can you see my?
Yeah, that's great.
All right, so close reading in the age of climate change. So when it comes to the extent of challenges and the meagerness of the response, climate change has basically become a meme. The absurdity that emerges when paper straws are offered as a solution to avert the apocalypse. This is what Timothy Clark famously calls an instance of derangements of scale. Our concern with the commensurability of the scale of response and the scale of problem inevitably extends to intellectual response as well. There have been calls for fiction writers to experiment with modes of capturing scales beyond the normal scale of the serious novel, to borrow Amitav Ghosh's term. And then what seems like immediate laments of the failures to do so. Novelists, writers, and artists are clearly aware of the issue of scale as well. Just one recent example would be Kim Stanley Robinson's excruciatingly expansive novel, The Ministry for the Future, which aims to address this derangement of scale by its multitude of focalizers, variety of prose styles, numerous fictional solutions to climate change, and frankly, its enormous length. This is what prompts me to co-opt Terry Eagleton's memorable aphorism that if modernism was haunted by time and postmodernism was obsessed by space, the narrative in the Anthropocene is beset by scale. However, while I touch on the issues of scale in narrative, my main focus in this talk is the issues of scale in reading narrative. So a few disclaimers are needed. First, while I'm exclusively talking about climate change and the ecological scale here, I see no reason other scalar issues wouldn't also apply. The denialism and political responses to COVID have shown that super small and super big cause similar cultural derangements. Secondly, my talk is somewhat personal. I did my bachelor's and master's in English, where close reading is practically the default methodology, and disciplinary existential crisis is rampant. And now at the end of my first year in an interdisciplinary PhD program where I have the opportunity or the burden of thinking about the nature of methodology in approaching a topic that is immensely scalar. So this presentation is a meditation or is a meditation or rant on the method that I've been taught, its limitations and possible solutions. And thirdly, a point on terminology. I use hermeneutics and interpretive methodologies loosely and interchangeably, not necessarily limited to their exact historical or philosophical definitions. What I mean by them is generally the methodology used in English, cultural studies, area studies, film and theater, and other humanities departments, which is, in simple terms, reading text or consuming media and subjectively analyzing it. It is the oft forgotten third cousin of quantitative or qualitative approaches. A bit more a way of knowing rather than a methodology. Similarly, I use close reading beyond its strict new criticism context to refer to any form of knowledge making that relies on subjective interpretation through a close attention to a text, whether written or not. I also use normal meso or bodily scales to refer to the scale of meters in which humans and other mid-sized animals exist. So speaking of scale, I use Joshua DiCallio's definition, which is a robust definition, that scale is a systematic accounting for significant shifts in a measured range of observation. Now, I don't intend to spoil his keynote that is coming after this panel, but one thing is key about DiCallio's definition that I think should be discussed. DiCallio defines significant shift in such a way that we end up with only a handful of domains. That is mainly because he differentiates between scale and logical types. Logical types are any group of things that can be looked at in aggregate, but are not necessarily in different scales. For example, DiCallio argues that the concepts of city, nation, or all humans are not different scales, but just logical types. In order for a logical type to scale up, it needs to include elements that exist in other scales. For example, the global economy can be said to belong to a different scale because it includes not just humans, but also the entirety of carbon emissions, as well as all yeasts on Earth. With this definition, anything one scale above the mesoscale belongs to the ecological scale, and we only artificially limit its boundaries to a portion of the Earth's ecology for studying. While I immensely appreciate DiCallio's narrowing down of scalar domains and his clear delineation of what exactly is scale and what is just a logical type, this definition, while compelling for material or real things, is somewhat restrictive for scale in narrative, or generally scale in abstraction. And mainly because in most cases, what is referred to as scale in literary theory, for example, world literature, national literature, corpora, and so on, are not scales according to this definition. The use of logical types is the reason I'm using this definition rather than Zach Horton's, even though I suspect Horton's use of resolving cuts is more accommodating to more constructed senses of scale that I'm concerned with. Because I think the perspective of aggregation in logical types is precisely why subjective perspective of humans can't discern constructed scale from real or material scale. This sense of scale is mildly difficult to use in the context of hermeneutics, because insofar as we're concerned with interpretation and individual perspectives, humans don't see larger logical types that involve aggregation but not different scales, that differently from actual different scales. And DiCallio acknowledges that aggregation creates that jarring experience that while I am part of the type all humans, I only experience the world as one human. I suspect the difference between scales and logical types often does not register because the effects of aggregation that happen in both scales and types are far more important for us than the ontological shifts that occur only in scales. So in case of climate change, the fundamental issue is what many ethicists know as the problem of cumulative action. The fact that my individual impact on the climate is non-existent, but my aggregated impact is apocalyptic, what Greg Garrett calls the unbearable lightness of green. The fact that carbon ontologically might shift from, say, charcoal in the mesoscale to an invisible accumulated blanket on Earth in an ecological scale is not as big of a concern as is the accumulated action of all humans. And it's not just a matter of degrees either, but also the question that do abstract concepts have scale? What I mean by abstraction here in relation to social construction is analogous to thing in relation to ontology. DiCallio explains that scale precedes ontology, epistemology, and social construction. But the thing that would ontologically be a tree on one scale and then become a forest on another exists on both scales. Now, if the social construction of a concept such as nation only emerges on one scale, is there an abstraction that exists on other scales but perceived differently? For example, the abstraction of similar people in close proximity, that on one scale would be the construction of family or community, but on another become nation. I'm inclined to think so. And as for my argument that there is such a thing as abstraction that has scales, I'll conduct a bit of conscious, motivated reasoning to argue that most abstractions are on a different scale than the mesoscale. Firstly, we could treat scale theory as a reflexive term and enact recursion on it. If we increase the resolution of the area between the mesoscale and ecological scale, that is, commit a scalar shift on the concept of scale itself, then we could argue that the ontological difference of scale and logical types might shift as well. If this argument is too convoluted, another justification for why most abstraction or cultural construction do exist on more than mesoscales is that non-humans and materials do often seep into these logical types. For example, the notion of nation does not merely include, say, 30 million people within an arbitrary enclosure, but it also includes the material petroleum that enables access between them, or communication systems, which rely on electrons or photons, or even the natural landscape that contributes to that sense of nation. With not great an effort, one could notice that in any social construction or abstraction that involves aggregation of more than a few people, there exist things that belong to other scales. This could be war, democracy, capital, gender, climate change, and so on. And with this comes all the derangements of thinking about them. When it comes to narratives, such definitions are even more difficult to play with. Firstly, we could get pedantic and argue narratives don't have scales as such. The material book that I hold in my hand exists in the mesoscale, but the story world that is constructed while my reading exists in my imagination. In that case, either the story world is without scale or necessarily bound to the bodily scale as well. And since imagination doesn't seem to have thresholds that you can shift and see an ontological shift, or maybe with psychedelics you could, but anyways, it doesn't make sense to speak about different scales in story worlds. And note that in this case, story world is not a social construction or abstraction, as it is not in aggregate. It is simply an individual's thought. So even my clunky expansion of the definition of scale doesn't apply. Now, let's forget this unwieldy frame of thought and assume that representational scale of the story worlds, that is, for example, if it's a psychological novel about one character or an ideal encyclopedic novel about globality, is actually a conception of referred scale. Well, then scale still is much more reliant on the interpretation of the audience than the story world itself. No matter how maximalist and expansive the narrative, one cannot underestimate the power of a reader to interpret the story allegorically and apply it to individual life. But also, if we consider either of my justifications for scalarity of abstractions, focus on different scales in narratives in novels is not new. Novelists have always been interested in issues of other scales, such as nation, capital, globality, the cosmos, etc. But no one had a qualm with the inherently synecdochic method of representation in narrative before climate change. Nonetheless, let's leave these problems unresolved and focus on how, as scholars of narratives, we can generate knowledge that can interact with different scales. The incommensurability of close reading is simple and obvious at the first glance. The unit of differentiation in close reading is individual texts, and so the only knowledge claims close reading can make is about individual texts. This has been observed by Franco Moretti, among others, that close reading emerged in an environment that only few texts mattered. But close reading not only cannot make claims about scalar issues of world literature that Moretti is concerned with, it also cannot make claims about cultural observations, that is, for example, ideology, questions of gender or race, environmental thinking, because those types are aggregations of far more than few texts and there is nothing to suggest that these texts are quintessential emblems of those logical types. The trouble with close reading, this is what Franco Moretti says, in all of its incarnations, from the new criticism to deconstruction, is that it necessarily depends on an extremely small canon. This may have become an unconscious and invisible premise by now, but is an iron one nonetheless. You invest so much in individual texts only if you think that very few of them really matter. Now, a useful opportunity for grounding scale in interpretive methodologies is that it offers a new formulation of the relationship between cultural studies on one hand and literary studies, film studies, theater studies on the other, what I would generally call them art form studies. Again, here, I won't delve into the historical, theoretical specifics of the cultural turn and so on, which is no doubt pertinent, but perhaps not crucial for my general appraisal of the problem. By art form studies, I simply mean those aspects of English departments or film departments and so on that are more concerned with how to interpret specific texts and what it means for their specific medium. This would perhaps involve perspectives such as narrative theory, some sort of formal concern, questions of literariness, and so on. By cultural studies, I simply mean perspectives that see texts emblematically as signs of cultural, ideological, and political trends. These would involve well-known terms such as Frederick Jameson's symptomatology, Raymond Williams's structures of feeling. Seen through the lens of scale, the incommensurability of cultural studies and close reading lies not just in the fact that they value texts differently, but that they involve different scales of reading. Art form studies is concerned with individual members of logical types, but cultural studies aims to understand the logical type without having access to it. Seen this way, it is strange to think an element within a text can be a symptom of a nation's ideology. If it would have been in material terms, could we say that Bill Gates's carbon footprint is the symptom of all carbon emissions, or an impoverished farmer's is a symptom of all carbon emissions? One simply cannot make claims about a scale by studying another scale. And as an aside, it's amusing to reflect on the fact that, for example, Marjorie Perloff in her 1999's Crisis in the Humanities was debating whether literary scholars who do cultural studies are doing interdisciplinary work or other disciplinary work, whereas now cultural studies has completely been absorbed into English departments. My criticism doesn't stem from a sense of literary elitism, though, simply that these two ways of seeing texts, although are entangled right now, are incommensurable in a scalar sense. So Timothy Clark has a term for the method of driving banal cultural truisms from narratives, intellectual miniaturization, that can be attributed to this scalar incommensurability. The critic removes the details and internal ambivalences of text with the hope of aggregating it into a higher scale, but because there is not much to aggregate it with, the higher scale of knowledge is not created. So if close reading cannot make claims about scales beyond individual texts, then let's take a look at other interpretive methods that have tried to access the spectrum of scale. We'll start with Timothy Clark. In his book, Eco-Criticism on the Edge, he offers an example of scale-aware close reading, which definitely benefits from his background in deconstruction. He analyzes Raymond Carver's short story, The Elephant, through three lenses. On the first level, which would be the individual scale, the psychological peculiarities of the protagonist are foregrounded. On the second level, the national scale, which Clark notes is the default scale of criticism, the short story is an instance of a historical period, the dark side of Reagan's America. On the third environmental level, with a, say, perspective of 600 years, the interpretation becomes incredibly strange. All aspects of individuality and psychology become irrelevant, and throwaway lines become the most impactful, like the fact that the protagonist has children. The scale on this level, according to Clark, doesn't frame, but unframes. The third scale, Clark says, the third scale reading is indifferent to whether or not there is an Oedipal dynamic to the speaker's actions. It does not build up any image of psychological depth. It does not deepen so much as flatten. A kind of environmental unconscious of unthought side effects emerges that has nothing to do with personal complexes or psychic dynamics, but which is situational, contextual, and unregarded realm, the unregarded realm of what can't be helped simply by going to buy food or get to work. The unattended to physicality of what passes without thought. Clark notes that in higher scales of reading, individuals become more and more like things, only important in what they leave behind than their lives. This scalar reading is an interesting thought experiment, albeit with some eco-fascism vibes, but it is not a sustainable methodology, simply because, again, narratives differentiate themselves on a normal scale. So all stories read with a 600-year perspective would yield roughly the same interpretation. Franco Moretti's distant reading would be an immediate contender for a scalar methodology. His quantitative method of aggregating texts into the higher scale of corpora or the lower scale of the word is a direct response to the scalar limitations of close reading, and Moretti is perhaps the most vocal against close reading. He says distant reading doesn't have the problems of cultural studies though. Research questions and the data are both on the same scale. What is erased here in aggregation and scalar shift is the intratextual ambivalences, the questions of meaning. This wouldn't necessarily be a methodological problem. It is just something that makes many literary scholars sad, because that's what literature is so damn good at. It's a shame that it's not studied. Distant reading is then scalary coherent, but it's no longer interpretive. While Moretti's mixed method employs quantitative approaches, the emerging field of empirical eco-criticism incorporates qualitative methods. Their aim is, however, more modest. Matthew Schneider-Meyerson et al. Admit that some humanists see the social sciences as a threat, especially in the context of the neoliberal academy. By no means we are asserting that all eco-critics should immediately enroll in social science boot camps. Social scientific methods are not only suboptimal, but potentially useless for other jobs, such as historical or aesthetic analysis, or exploring the meaning of a given text or genre. We are arguing that eco-critics ought to rely on, if not conduct, social scientific research for causal claims related to reception. Yet we are not suggesting that eco-critics should only study the impact of environmental narratives on their audiences, or that empirical approaches are more important than other forms of investigation. So what they seek is only to resolve the main scalar question that environmental literature has real impact on the world by assessing the affect of the readers. This is of utmost importance because a key assumption of eco-criticism is that studying environmentally engaged text is valuable and an important enterprise, socially, culturally, and politically. Much similar to distant reading, empirical eco-criticism is equipped to answer the questions it asks, but not the questions of interpretation and meaning. But it is quite admirably conscious of that. Many scholars of literature pedagogy have noted that close reading has not only been influential in literary scholarship, but also, or even more so, in classrooms. This has prompted the claims that the communal experience of reading in a classroom is a research methodology in its own right. Mark C. Long, for example, explains that to talk about close reading, first, we need to discuss the value of reading. For all our fantasies that our work will lead to great challenge, no actual effect of our work as teachers or scholars has been demonstrated. He argues that the value of close reading is in its closeness to others. What Mark C. Long says is that this practice of reading in proximity to others is a socially situated, radically contingent, and potentially more consequential activity than the disciplinary routine of circulating scholarly or professional readings that advances a particular theory or demonstration of its claims. Long claims that the pedagogical trajectory I envision for close reading must, at the same time, reimagine classroom work, that is, the reading and thinking and writing of students as a collective scholarly project. He then goes on to provide new definitions of close reading based on the scholarship's on the psychology of reading, and then suggestions for the labor of the academic model. And finally, Long hopes that reimagining the experience of literary engagement as a collective activity redefines close reading as a relational activity. Close reading makes available the indices of attention that arise in an experience of literary engagement that includes both the reader, the collective of readers in the classroom, and the social processes of attending to reciprocal and mutually constitutive relations. An initiative with goals similar to those of Long's is happening in my institution in the field lab, spelled FEELED lab, led by Astrida Neymanes, which is an interdisciplinary environmental humanities field lab dedicated to fostering feminist, anti-colonial, queer, anti-racist, and inclusive perspectives into the environment and our relationship with it. They draw on social art practice methods and stage monthly fringe nature events structured loosely around a theme, for example, darkness, thaw, weeding, located in specific places open to anyone who wants to join, and involving some low-stakes participatory activity, as well as monthly littoral listening events, which is basically a reading group, but most of the time there will be spent listening to others. The aim is to think about how to do our reading group practice. The aim is to think about how our reading group practices change when we turn our focus to listening. These events are modes of collaborative research into place and eco-cultural identity. These ways of what can be loosely called reading are in some way instances of localization. That is, they solve the issue of large scales by intentionally not engaging with them directly. The hope, perhaps, is that the community becomes a more than individual scale that is still relatable. And finally, Wei-Chi Dimmock's weak theory is a compelling effort to resolve the inherent inadequacy of the previously mentioned emblematic reading. Dimmock borrows the concept of weak theory from sociology, the idea that weak networks of partial members with intermittent engagements in more than one group, freely entered into rather than institutionally prescribed, are more resilient than small, tight-knit circles with information overlap. Accurately observing that both our ecosystem and our discipline are in desperate need of resilience in facing those situations where neither the solution nor even the nature of the problem is self-evident, and where unexpected input from unexpected quarters could make a significant difference. She then argues that we should embrace shaky paradigms with incomplete resolutions. So in her book, Weak Planet, Literature and Assisted Survival, she liberally weaves concepts from disability studies, literary history, sound studies, sociology, and many other fields, and compares seemingly incomparable texts, not worrying whether those are truly emblematic of the logical type, because the logical type is everything. Dimmock's framework is extremely liberating for critics. However, much like Mark C. Long's, it requires a complete restructuring of the idea that the goal of reading is to clarify, elucidate, interpret, or evaluate. Meaning Dimmock too is solving the issue by not solving it. Now, I'm aware that this was somewhat of an unusual presentation. It is more akin to thinking out loud than having an argument per se. And so, firstly, in the spirit of being unusual, I actually would welcome what all presenters certainly hate, questions that are actually more of a comment, especially if you have personal experience with issues of scale in interpretive methodologies. But as for the conclusion, there is none, because my research has only started. I can only offer platitudes that keep me going in these stages of pre-research. Firstly, that interdisciplinarity is indeed important. What hermeneutics lacks in mediating scale, it offers in nuanced studies of ambivalence and meaning. And for all their ability to engage with other scales, quantitative and qualitative methods desperately need someone to notice what they are erasing through aggregation. And secondly, that what we are trying to do, work with climate change, understand scalarity, are nearly impossible, but the effort is valiant. And even though I'm skeptical of the ability or the interest of the interpretive methodologies to accommodate scale theory, that does not mean that the framework of scale is not of use. The crucial service of scale theory for hermeneutics is a rigorous challenge on the basis of knowledge claims, a way of assessing that the data explored in the text has not crossed a scalar threshold on its way to conclusion that has fundamentally shifted what it is. Something that happens quite often in mixed art form cultural studies. Timothy Clark again argues that thinking of climate change in relation to literary or cultural criticism will not be a matter of inventing some new method of reading per se, for its most prominent effect is of a derangement of scale that is also an implosion of intellectual competences. I don't know if inventing new methods of reading will be the matter or not, but I agree with the latter part of this claim. And resolving this implosion starts from becoming conscious of the methodological scale of our knowledge. Thank you.
Thanks for a great presentation, Yazdan. That was really, really interesting. So there'll be time for discussion of this at the end of the panel. So people watching, please post your questions in the Q&A feature now. I'm just going to show, there we go. So these are our two upcoming speakers. So this, oops, excuse me. So there are my notes, there we go. So this is Sara Upstone and Kristian Shaw. Sara Upstone is Professor of Contemporary Literature and Faculty Director of Postgraduate Research at Kingston School of Art at Kingston University. Her publications include Rethinking Race and Identity in Contemporary British Fiction, British Asian Fiction, 21st Century Voices, and Spatial Politics in the Post-Colonial Novel. She is co-editor of Postmodern Literature and Race, Researching and Representing Mobility's Transdisciplinary Encounters, Post-Colonial Spaces, the Politics of Place in Contemporary Culture, and forthcoming with Kristian Shaw, 21st Century Fiction, Harry Kunzru, as well as another collaborative work with Peter Ely, From Blair to Brexit, Community in Contemporary British Fiction. Wow, that's an impressive amount of publications. And Kristian Shaw has a similarly impressive list of work. He is a senior lecturer and MA program leader in English literature at the University of Lincoln. He released his first monograph, Cosmopolitanism in 21st Century Fiction, in 2017. His research project was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. His second monograph is entitled Brexlit, that's how you pronounce it, British Literature and the European Project. Brexlit is a term he coined in 2016 to describe cultural responses to Brexit. He is also co-editor of 3 collections, Kazuo Ishiguro with Peter Sloan, Harry Kunzru with Sara Upstone, and the Bloomsbury Guide to 21st Century British Literature with Katie Shaw. He serves as a reader for the journal 21st Century Literature and sits on the executive committee of the British Association of Contemporary Literary Studies. So their talk today is entitled Simultaneity of Scale, Contemporary Transglossic Literature. As I said, Sara and Kristian chose to pre-record their presentation. It's easier to do it with 2 people if it's pre-recorded. So I'll now play that video and they'll be available at the end to take your questions.
In January of this year, the American novelist Hanya Yanagihara released To Paradise, her 3rd novel, and much anticipated since the massive success of A Little Life 7 years previously. A Little Life is a vast, sprawling novel of over 700 pages, focused on the intimate stories of a group of New York friends. Yet while To Paradise matches the size of its predecessor, coming in at 720 pages, its scale is strikingly different. While, as the ironic title suggests, and indicating that Yanagihara is well aware of concepts of scale, A Little Life makes small-scale events vast in the attention they receive. To Paradise is a vast book of vast scale, presented in 3 sections which span 3 centuries. The first is set in 1893, the second in 1993, and the third in the midst of a pandemic in 2093. At least one of the sections, the first, is set in an alternate world, in which slavery exists but the laws against homosexuality of the 19th century have been repealed. What unites these 3 sections is a house and a series of names. Each section features a home in Washington Square, New York, and each section also features key characters who share the names of those in the other sections of the narrative. This expansiveness is not only a matter of trans-historical placement, but also operates through a recourse to a mythic structure. In the movement between individual stories embedded in named places and a vast 300-year canvas, Yanagihara employs a strategy more in keeping with contemporary magical realist evocations of fairy tale, themselves examples of conterminous particularity and universality. In one small moment in the novel's final pandemic section, its narrator, a young woman called Charlie, tells us of an incident in which she goes out into Washington Square with her grandfather and hears a storyteller, a man who was once a famous writer. The story Charlie hears, we come to realize, is the story of the first part of the book, of a young man who forsakes his riches to leave his family and head to California to follow the person he loves, a man who may or may not be disingenuous in his affections. Just as the first part of the book ends without revealing what has happened to the young man, so the storyteller disappears before Charlie finds out the ending to the story. She returns again and again, hoping to hear the ending, and every story she hears after fails to live up to the promise of this one story, which has the potential both of happiness and of failure. It is not clear in this moment whether this story is the history of Charlie's own world or merely a fiction. She does not reveal the gender of the man's beloved in the story she hears, so we cannot know whether it aligns with her own in terms of the treatment of sexuality. She says that the story is about a man who had lived here, on this very island, on this very square. And yet when she reflects on her desire to know how the story ends, she says, "I knew it was foolish, because they weren't even real people." This incident transforms the first part of the book into a radicalized form of fairy tale, embedded within the much larger fairy tale of the entire book, emerging from a future which bears the legacy of our own revisions of such tales, so that they are no longer abstract and have become specific in their location. This vastness is a new feature of Yanagihara's work. Like A Little Life, her first novel, The People in the Trees, has a discrete historical time frame and exists within a single reality. Yet she combines it with features of intimacy that resonate with her earlier works. Each section of the novel is focused on familial relationships, particularly those between grandfathers, fathers, and children. Critical opinion on the novel has been sharply divided, predominantly negative in fact, but with a smaller number of critics who have defended the work. At the centre of these critical debates have been questions regarding the novel's incorporation of these familial stories into such a vast landscape, with reviews suggesting that the novel is part of a genre of fiction that takes in a large number of social and political issues with only superficial concern. An example of this is Deb's review for the New Republic, which objects to the fact that the interfigurality of the novel goes nowhere, declaring a smallness of the novel's maximalism as it is accused of failing to do justice to the heavy themes with which it engages. For all the references to liberation movements in Hawaii in this section, Deb writes, the story remains resolutely small-scale. Yanagihara, caught between her usual concern with interpersonal dynamics and what she sees as the weighty responsibility of the dystopia genre. Critics of the novel are in this respect pulled into a reactionary appraisal of the novel's content because of the expectation that the narrative will speak to our current moment. In presenting a novel that includes a pandemic, that features questions of gay rights and racial identity, they look within the narrative for answers with specificity to each of these issues. Equally, they look for connections to explain the interfigurality that dominates the novel. Yet rather than this, what we uncover instead are characters whose significance has refused continuousness. instead changing and mutating to resist narratives of inheritance or equivalence, their place in the story resonant with Tom Cohen's conceptualization of contemporary telemorphosis. The characters all experience injustice, but in entirely different frames of reference. The house in New York and the names both anchors to remind the reader that there is indetectable continuity within the seemingly disparate. By presenting this world that's simultaneously continuous and yet distinct across centuries, Yanagihara captures in narrative form what Timothy Morton has written about in Everything We Need, Scarcity, Scale, Hyperobjects, as the urgency of acknowledging our scalar relationship to the ecosystem. So Morton writes, in 30,000 years, let alone 100,000 years, two things will be true. No one will be meaningfully related to me, and everything that happens will bear the traces of my actions. And this is what we see into Paradise. We see a group of characters who we expect to be related, and they aren't. They are not meaningfully related to each other at all. And yet we have the sense that everything that happens to characters as the novel goes on bear the traces of the actions of the characters in previous stories. A rare critic to recognise this, Jordan Kisner, writing in The Atlantic, recounts how he began the novel by trying to make associations, driven to draw a chart and work out how each character related to their future namesake, only to come to the conclusion that I suspected that the challenge Yanagihara sets for the reader isn't so much to decode a puzzle as to survive a plunge into chaos theory, the dizzying way that minor events and personal choices might have created countless alternate histories and futures. Such awareness of the inherited trace defies anthropocentric logic and is radical in its call for reconfigured perceptions of justice. Indeed, To Paradise centers around moral and political questions regarding the boundaries of responsibility. The Charlie character in the final section of the novel has been permanently disabled by the medical treatment she receives for the deadly virus. It's a treatment that's only available to her because her grandfather is a government scientist. Charlie's grandfather's perspective on disability shifts inexorably with his granddaughter's illness. The intimate associations with her potential death causes him to re-evaluate previous attitudes that identified disabled lives as less valuable, as he does everything to save her life. In this consciousness, there is explicit acknowledgement of the self-interest that shapes most seemingly moral imperatives. And he writes, when I was an undergraduate, a professor of mine had said there were two types of people, those who wept for the world and those who wept for themselves. Weeping for your family, he said, was a form of weeping for yourself. Those who congratulate themselves on their sacrifices for their families aren't actually sacrificing at all, he said, because their family is an extension of themselves and therefore a manifestation of the ego. True selflessness, he said, meant giving of yourself to a stranger, someone whose life would never be entangled with your own. Asking what it might mean to commit to the other in such terms, Charlie's grandfather rehearses the Derridean priority as outlined in Cosmopolitanism and Forgiveness, that ethics is hospitality, which, as Dan Bully has argued, is a multi-scalar project that cannot be limited to a single scale. Yet in acknowledging his prejudices, Charlie's grandfather also draws attention to the Derridean awareness that both unconditional hospitality and the responsibility which it evokes are ultimately impossible, sacrificed to the demands of the conditional and thus always to come, and yet to be pursued nevertheless, as the flawed commitment to the realization of that impossibility becomes the only ethical position that counts. Charlie's wondering about the story that she hears in the square years later is a catalyst for her own drive for possibility. The novel ends with her attempt to escape New York and an inconclusive ending which leaves the reader uncertain as to her fate. The storytelling episode therefore operates metafictionally to foreshadow the novel's own operation, a series of narratives each without endings, each requiring commitment without the security that comes from an intimate or immediate relation. The novel, this incident tells us, is driving the reader, like Charlie, towards an investment in possibility without the promise or guarantee that a resolution will ever be seen. This is woven into the book's spatiality. The title, To Paradise, posits New York as the conduit to a mythical place elsewhere. The to is essential here. It posits that paradise is never quite real, just out of reach and being travelled toward, and as such, always elusive. Yanagihara's refusal to pull the narrative into the constraints of reader expectation and provide intimate connection between its three sections is a call to recognize the limitations of the intimate empathy its characters convey, and the reliance of truly radical action on empathy that is able to transcend threads of connection. There is in this respect more continuity with her previous work than is initially apparent. At the centre of A Little Life is the idea that friendship relationships may exceed the value of familial ones, and that within familial relations, blood ties are not always the most powerful, the strongest familial relationship in the novel being that of an adoptive father with his son. To Paradise dramatically extends such thinking, to posit an ethics with consequences both for the treatment of the unknown other to whom one is not inherently connected, and for the ethical investment in historical processes such as climate change, where results are unlikely to be seen. In exploring how such associations might form, the novel embraces the idea that language is not only the conduit for the negotiation of what Timothy Morton calls hyperobjects, vast phenomena with the potential to demolish anthropocentric domination of time and space, but a hyperobject itself, refusing to submit to the human will of either author or reader, phasing in and out of different times and spaces without consistent signification, and denying any sense of narrative mastery. The novel is not devoid of ethical perches, as some critics suggest, but rather asserts its ethics as a matter not of providing didactic answers on the questions of climate change, identity politics, or the global pandemic, but instead drawing attention to a simultaneously personal and trans-historical investment in ongoing uncertainty beyond the present moment. We offer this reading of Yanagihara's novel and its reception as introduction to a wider tendency in contemporary writing that we have termed the Transglossic. In 2021, we co-authored an article in the journal English Studies on this idea, arguing that existing critical terminologies based on recourse to the suffix modernism, such as metamodernism and hypermodernism, are caught in a relation to the past that inadvertently separates them from the outward-looking focus of much contemporary fiction. We suggest the Transglossic as an alternative that captures the newness and ethico-political activism of this writing. We define the Transglossic by 6 key features: deep simultaneity, planetary consciousness, intersectional transversality, artistic responsibility, productive authenticity, and finally, transformalism. The literal meaning of Transglossic is speaking across. Yanagihara's novel illuminates that such movement not only involves multiple identity positions, timeframes, and spatialities, but also an investment in the use of scale. In this respect, we draw in particular from Bradlow and Ladino's work on effective eco-criticism, recognized as a new, more compelling way to foreground connections between environmental and social justice, with the potential to reach across ideological species and scalar boundaries to find common ground in this new geologic epoch. Emotion, Bradlow and Ladino argue, is what takes us from the micro scale of the individual to the global scale needed to address questions of national and international policy and environmental change. So it is that, following from Alexa Weik von Mosser's work in her book Effective Ecologies, reading becomes an act of embodied cognition in which fictions imaginatively cue feelings of empathy on both global and individual scales. In transglossic fictions, disjunctions of space and time, the use of non-linearity and the simultaneous inclusion of multiple perspectives demands that readers enter into an immersive experience, asking them to connect repeatedly across multiple registers. Rather than seeing this as problematic as critics of To Paradise have done, scalar simultaneity rather becomes essential to questions of justice that exceed what can be achieved by localized affiliations, but which nevertheless recognizing the concerns of Timothy Clark and others, become meaningless if they exist only as global imaginaries, without reference to the specificities of time and place. It captures what Serpil Opperman, drawing from Morton, defines as the scalar mesh of the contemporary. Reading such relations as forming stories within complex networks of narrative agencies can be a counterpoint to common Anthropocene visions fixed on the anthropos as a geological force. This material ecocritical vision can in fact lead us towards an understanding of the Anthropocene as plural phenomena with interlaced stories of natures and cultures congealing at multiple scales. What is unravelled here is a mesh of humans, non-humans, geophysical forces and toxic substances, locked in multiplex and often dangerous relations, disclosing a sense of an overly disenchanted world. As well as being about geological epocality, the Anthropocene is also about this mesh, an uncanny interconnectedness between living and non-living forms. Simultaneity thus underpins in this respect all other features of transglossic form, but in particular is essential to the association of such fictions with planetary consciousness and authorial responsibility. What we refer to as deep simultaneity as a core feature of the transglossic emphasizes that this scalar relation is not a matter of contrast or tension, but of concomitant immersion in the local and the global, the recent and the historical, with effective association at an intimate level, a precursor to global empathy, but not itself enough to constitute justice. Simultaneity in this regard can be contrasted to the metamodernist conception of oscillation. For the leading critics of metamodernism, Vermeulen and van den Akker, meta implies a form of ontologically pendulous association between and beyond oppositional poles. This oscillation, or metaxis, concerns a modern desire for meaning and a postmodern doubt about the sense of it all, which is, they argue, immediately evident in late 20th century works of fiction. Yet while this formulation reaches for the inhabitancy of alternating scales, our reading is concerned rather with the conterminous occupation of multiplicity. It is perhaps telling that metamodernism's focus almost entirely on Western literatures has overlooked this important aspect of the contemporary. Writing on the use of multiple scales, in Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things, for example, Jane Poyner recognizes that, rather than producing a set of concurrent if conflictual readings, Roy's novel initiates embedded ones. These spatio-temporal complemences are well theorized by Homi K. Barber and his concept of time lag, as it is developed in the location of culture. The simultaneous existence in both past and present, the here and the elsewhere, the intimate and the planetary. Barber's reading rests upon the notion of scalar difference as metonymic rather than metaphoric, an associative process which crucially retains the specificity of the times and spaces under discussion, necessary in order to avoid what Mattei Kandera refers to as the risk of hospitality as scale-free abstraction. By taking such a form, novelists can be seen as responding to what Amitav Ghosh, quoted by Adam Grenner in 2020, notes as the conventional struggle for fiction with its self-contained worlds to address the scales demanded of by the current moment. As Amitav Ghosh argues in The Great Derangement, the deliberately prosaic worlds of serious prose fiction struggle to confront the challenges of the Anthropocene because of the conventions that shape the construction of those narrative worlds. Ghosh identifies the scale of resistance the Anthropocene presents to some of the central formal features that define the modern novel, from its emphasis on the everyday and individual moral adventure to its exclusion of non-human agency and reliance upon settings that become self-contained ecosystems, detached from larger forces or longer temporal spans. Greener's essay makes an argument for realism as a form capable of addressing such imperatives, contesting Ghosh's own argument that science fiction is more suited to such demands. This lack of consensus aligns with our own contention against that of various post-postmodernisms, that it is not form that defines the transglossic, so much as the manipulation of form in the service of an expansive scalar multiplicity. It is a shifting fictional imperative addressed explicitly in Ali Smith's Autumn. In one scene, the central characters of Daniel, an aging artist, and Elizabeth, a young woman, discuss her future plans. Responding to her declared desire to study everything, Daniel replies, "That's why you need to go to collage." When Elizabeth challenges his incorrect word usage, his reply is a declaration of a new kind of artistic practice. Collage is an institute of education where all the rules can be thrown into the air, and size and space and time and foreground and background all become relative, and because of this everything you think you know gets made into something new and strange. Daniel's evocation of a form in which size and space and time and foreground and background all become relative declares a commitment to the creative power of scalar disruption. As Derek Woods notes in his work on scale variance, however, to think of scale in relation to the Anthropocene is to think of assemblages which track more than the human across different scales of operation. And I will now pass over to Kristian, who will explore how this aspect of the Transglossic works in more detail.
As Sara has explained, Transglossic literature is defined by the simultaneous occupation of multiple timeframes, perspectives, scales and spatialities, and is driven by the productive possibilities of dialogic encounters that draw readers towards similarity and connection in contrast to disjunctive tensions. With this in mind, one notable feature of the Transglossic framework is the idea of a planetary consciousness, a consciousness integral to certain literary works which draw on differing scales of relationality and simultaneity to advance ecological discourses and global citizenhood. This urgent need to reconcile human and planetary scales aligns with thought cultivated by other scholars such as Paul Gilroy's notion of planetary humanism and Ursula Hayes' sense of planet. As Jimenez Asperg and Hedren suggest, one of the stumbling blocks many scholars and citizens alike face in thinking through the environment is this issue of scale. They argue the difficulty of grasping these phenomena and effects leads to alienation, whereby human stakeholders do not feel invested in environmental issues. In the second section of our talk today, I will draw upon a novel which communicates this very difficulty through a fictional exploration of planetary concerns, Richard Powers' 2021 novel Bewilderment. Powers wrote Bewilderment immediately after his expansive Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Overstory, which also advances a trans-species cosmopolitanism whereby the fictional form itself behaves as an ecosystem. No single character or scale takes preference, and the conclusion of each individual narrative rests in a symbiotic relationship on its relational existence to others. As former President Barack Obama comments, the Overstory changed how I thought about the Earth and our place in it. And Powers' use of scale in this earlier novel stresses the importance of non-human agency, what Jane Bennett terms the agency of the assemblage, in accentuating the need to decenter the human in order to prevent the continuation of a distinctly anthropocentric arrogance with regards to planetary ecosystems. In his body of work more broadly, Powers forges a consilience between the arts and the sciences in order to better imagine ways of imagining and understanding scalar disjunctiveness. So his subsequent novel, Bewilderment, though enjoying a narrower and less encompassing scale than the Overstory, reflects several elements of the Transglossic framework in its attempt to position the human and the idea of the Anthropocene against more planetary scales of operation. The very term Anthropocene, after all, poses its own special scale issues because it reaffirms the limitations that species thinking imposes. The novel introduces us to Theo, a widowed astrobiologist, who is raising his 9-year-old son Robin alone, and Robin is presumed to have learning difficulties and suffers from behavioural issues since the death of his mother, Alyssa. He retreats into a private world of his own making, focusing on the extinction of certain animals and species rather than engaging with homework or friends. His father Theo's work as an astrobiologist, building these simulated worlds to determine whether exoplanets beyond our solar system can support life, complements this multi-scalar approach between the planetary and the personal. Indeed, the novel is punctuated by these cosmic biographies of imaginary planets that Theo invents at bedtime to make Robin consider more closely the shared precarity between human, non-human, and material vulnerabilities, and also the inherent threat to his own world. His fear of the Fermi paradox, which is the lack of evidence for extraterrestrial life in the universe, hints at the fragile nature of existence and the environmental losses sustained much closer to home. In developing these parallels between microcosmic and macrocosmic scales, Powers constructs what can be seen as an intimate otherness, as Stroud puts it, in which readers are asked to extend their empathetic identification beyond the human, connecting with Jane Bennett's notion of enchantment via an ethical engagement with the scale of non-human diversities. Before bedtime, Robin often recites his mother's prayer, almost as a protective charm against the environmental destruction and political rapaciousness he witnesses all around them. Quote, "There are 4 good things worth practicing: being kind towards everything alive, staying level and steady, feeling happy for any creature anywhere that is happy, and remembering that any suffering is also yours." And he combines this into a statement, "May all beings be free from suffering." So Robin espouses a distinctly biophilic approach, which Eric Fromm would describe as a passionate love of life and all that is alive. Yet he moves away from understanding the natural world from an anthropocentric stance or purely for a human scale. In this sense, Powers has clearly been influenced, such as ethicists like Peter Singer in his exhaustive study of the expanding circle, or Stacey Elemo's bodily natures, for example, which draw on multi-scalar contrasts to question how far the circle of empathy will stretch in order to grant this moral consideration to animals, plants, non-human species, even to the scale of ecosystems and the Earth itself. In Ecologies of Effect, Davison, Park and Shields remind us that scale is spatial, social and political, encompassing scales of interaction, scales of meaning and scales of engagement. One might ask, at what scale should life be lived? And Robin is certainly more in tune with the possibility of astral immensities than the confusing reality of American politics and corporate negligence towards the environment. For example, he repeatedly anthropomorphizes animals, bestowing them with human qualities and treating animals with the same ethical equivalence as humans. He shows a trans-species policy of compassion in which the animal is no longer simply a metaphor for human concerns, but a subject of ethical responsibility in its own right. However, his obsession with the natural world is not simply a childlike retreat from the horrors of the contemporary American experience. On the way home from their cabin, he forces himself to listen to depressing radio news concerning Trump's presidency or ecological disasters around the world, insisting that to engage with the very local human scale is good citizenship. The novel reinforces this by documenting Robin's fascination with a fellow young environmental protester based on Greta Thunberg, and alluding to the actions of climate change movements such as Extinction Rebellion. But what Robin clearly objects to is what Simon Estock terms a hollow ecology, whereby political media discourses merely take a superficial stance in support of environmental issues, but fail to engage with or account for the scale frames required to adequately confront such crises. After all, human progress does not align with evolutionary advancement. Rather, as Tim Clark argues, the predatory supremacy of global neoliberal capitalism represents a further exploitative intensification of the scale of disjunctiveness, and that's irremediably alienated us from planetary modes. Robin, throughout the course of the novel, sees these concerns dismissed or ignored, thus foreclosing on the possibility of generating an ethical scale appropriate for the enormity of the ecological problems he perceives in the United States. Powers drives home this incommensurate relationship between capitalism and environmental ethics, echoing Jason Moore's contention that the term capitalocene might be more appropriate than Anthropocene in defining our contemporary moment. Indeed, when Robin decides to protest in Washington, D.C., holding a sign reading, "Help me, I'm dying," he's confronted by the Chief of Staff for the Assembly Minority Leader, who berates Robin and his father Theo, arguing that his sign is exploitative and his time should be spent working on larger scale community projects. His aggressive stance gestures to Naomi Klein's contention that responses to climate change that continue to put the entire burden on the individual and consumers are doomed to fail. And this is not to downplay the importance of the individual in tackling such scale issues, but rather to expand the scale of responses in order to address systemic problems of capitalism. For Tim Clark, on the other hand, any sense of individual responsibility is an engagement with deranged jumps in scale, and fantasies of agency. Despite Robin's burgeoning wonder and enchantment with the natural world, his story ends on a rather depressing note. His tragic death, injured and freezing in a river after trying to move stones to help animals, indicates that humans in the narrative inhabit the scale and perspective of the natural world. The natural world is not reduced to the scale of the human. Robin's death is just one small part of the ever-evolving ecosystem. Death occurs as a simple fact of life, and it does so without ecological nostalgia or sentimentality. And this categorical separation signifies not only are we by no means in charge of nature, we are not a necessity, let alone indispensable requirement to its ongoing operation. As Elizabeth Caroline Miller reminds us, the natural world obviously inhabits a longer time scale than the human, and assumes a wider and longer point of view. In spite of these conflicting scales, Powers strives to find common ground from which interspecies plant-human communication can grow. For transglossic literature, the tenets of planetary cosmopolitanism includes this impetus to address the aforementioned scalar disjunctiveness between the human and the fluid structures of ecological interdependence, rather than the simple voicing of multiple species. Powers thus forces the reader to probe the deeply ingrained anthropocentric limitations of their ecological mindset, blurring species boundaries and scales between the arboreal, the human, and the animal. However, Powers also questions how planetary consciousness and the lives of non-human entities can be narrated other than through human storytelling. According to Tim Baker, fiction can never be anything other than human, but the appearance of the non-human can challenge the implied anthropocentrism of the novel form. Robin's quest to give voice to multiple species and save them from extinction seems to align with Eovino and Opperman's assumption that non-human agents always depend for the telling of their stories on the material imagination of their human counterpart, which risks resurrecting the same old anthropocentrism of previous periods. Yet what other option does Robin have in order to support this non-human agency? At the very least, his efforts debunk our habit of worlding, as if we're the only storied beings, as Opperman puts it. Through Robin's teachings, the narrative places and centres planetary affinities with non-human entities that are often pushed to the margins or exist at the peripheries of contemporary globalized life. And so in so doing, Powers entangles his characters with the natural world to propose alternative livabilities, focusing attention to the way in which different organic materialities relate and mutually foster each other's existence. He thus challenges what Clarke terms our species narcissism. And so just to conclude, the title of the novel itself is rather revealing in this regard. It not only gestures to Powers' powerful critique of the current political moment, but the inability of contemporary systems to comprehend the scale required for these issues. If we decipher the etymology of the word bewilderment, it obviously stems from a state or condition of being confused or bewildered, but the term wilder is a back formation from the noun wilderness, meaning to lead astray, to lure into the wilds. Powers is thus directing the reader to a state of bewilderment, a wilding of the human towards the hope of finding a productive scale. He illuminates how these ecological aesthetics operate politically, effectively, as well as ethically, gesturing to that which is beyond the blinkered purview of the current political administration, serving as a poignant reminder of the precariousness of our ecological situation.
Thank you to Sarah and Kristian there for that really rich talk, really loads to get our teeth into. Just make sure you can be seen by everybody. Okay, so for everybody listening, please take time, throw some questions down there into the question and answers box. I saw someone had their hand up. If you could just write your question down, then we can ask the speakers. While everybody is taking a moment to have a think about that, I had a question that sort of comes on from one I asked to Zachary Horton that fits with both the papers. I don't normally like these questions, but I like to think this one works quite well. So it's to do with this question of the tension between the ethical and the political. And in Sarah and Kristian's presentation, I felt like this came up like again and again, whether it's in terms of like the critiques of Yanagihara for sort of her lack of explicit political project, whichever book people might be critiquing. The scene, Kristian, you were talking about in Bewilderment, of where the boy is being berated about exactly what his actions mean. What does politics mean? Is it an ethical action? And then also this question of like the expanding circle of empathy, and how does sort of ethical, political questions sort of intersect there. And I also kind of seem to see this in Yazdan's talk. It seemed to me like one of the key questions sort of implicit behind your talk is this question of what is literature really about, you know? Because if we're talking about what is literature studies, it's also about thinking about what is literature, and particularly in the context of scale of climate change, it then becomes a kind of ethical or political or ethico-political, or how do a kind of project potentially or not in relation to those. So if I kind of throw out those ideas, I don't know who would like to jump in first, but whoever wants to go for that. Yazdan, do you want to?
Yeah. So what I think about that is, well, we know that eco-criticism and environmental issues in literature have been political from the start. But I like to reiterate what Timothy Clark says, that it seems it's easier for writers and literary critics to go back to the familiar realm of discourse and ideas and what they've all been doing, rather than go focus on materials and real things, so to speak. And this is something I also see in the engagement of writers and literary scholars with environmental ethics. So the major issue of scale, as I mentioned, I think is accumulation. So what Dale Jamieson in his book Reason in a Dark Time mentions as the fundamental failure of ethics, the failure of consequentialist ethics, that you cannot account for actions that are seemingly insignificant on an individual scale, but accumulate to become apocalyptic events. And this is something that I don't think we see in literature. I think the engagement of literature with scale is still in the realm of ontology and inferred scale and representation, rather than doing what literature is already good at, which is focusing on synecdochic individual stories, but with the concern of the failures of scale, of ethics and scale.
I see, thank you. Did you want to jump in there, Kristian or Sara? Sorry, go for it, whoever wants to.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I suppose I also wanted to say before we started how much I enjoyed Yazdan's paper, so thank you for that. And what great scheduling this was to have a paper that had two close readings with a paper that was talking about the issue of close reading, because I think that's provided lots to think about. So it was really fascinating. I think certainly with the Yanagihara, I think you're right, Oliver, this is at the centre of the critiques, the sense that the novel is not, that scale gets in the way of the politics of the text. But I think for me what the novel is trying to do is to think about how that politics really is inherently limited in that kind of Derridean sense of it being something that rests upon a kind of othering, unless there is this larger ethical project. And then asking this question about, well, if that's the case, then how does the ethics not become an abstraction that loses the importance of the specificity of the political? So, you know, when you said, or is it ethico-political, you kind of answered the question, because I think that is what it is. But I think it's this attempt to look towards an ethics that wouldn't become an abstraction. And that's something that I think we see in a lot of these contemporary novels. And therefore, scale is a way to try and navigate between those specificities of the political and this broader ethical imperative.
I see, yeah.
That's better. Yeah, just to build on what Sara said there, I agree, and I also think that particularly for the text I looked at, for example, which is the work of Richard Powers, it's really a sense of a failure of scale and an acknowledgement that there's a failure to acknowledge the scale across
American society, for that example, and the deaths that amount from that and the frustrations that amount from that. Whereas, for example, we do start to see certain authors try to move beyond that idea of scalar disjunctiveness. And I think Yanagihara is definitely one of them. You know, as Yazdan was saying, there's often the issue in literature where you often find these novels which deal with the very small scale and try to gesture to these larger scales, but really it's just a form of very insular storytelling. But Yanagihara is really an example of how we can use the novel form, fiction, to speak to all these different kind of spatial temporal scales and frames of reference and anxieties, and the kind of idea of what we call it kind of deep simultaneity of appreciating those different levels of scale. So I mean, there are certain works out there that are starting to do it, but for the most part, literature on these issues is really about failure of scale for me.
Yeah, it's interesting because in some ways that kind of critique of the different scales and the way they don't sort of work, it makes me think of is it called Red by Orhan Pamuk, where you have like this theme of red running through the whole novel, but then it becomes just an aesthetic device, and you get points where it's just like the color on a door or on, I've forgotten exactly, and working all the way through. But the things you're talking about, if I remember rightly, don't seem to figure in the book in quite the same way. They're talking about this kind of political thing in relation to Sara and Kristian's talk. I was also, perhaps you could say a little bit more about the different words, these kind of suffixes, if you like, that you sort of attach to scalar. And so you have disjunctiveness comes up a lot, which sort of makes sense. You know, that's kind of whole reason we wanted to do this conference in the first place. But you also talk a lot about sort of simultaneity, multiplicity. You have embeddedness when you talk about the God of small things. And I was wondering whether you could perhaps say a bit more about sort of perhaps where those kind of concepts came from, what you kind of want to do with those concepts, and sort of, is there something specifically literary about your use of those concepts, or are you hoping that they kind of have some purchase beyond literature? Because I suppose it's kind of, sorry, it's quite a few questions here, but it's kind of, do we have the issue of scalar collapse when we talk about simultaneity within the novel? If we have multiplicity, is there the danger that like Zach's sort of this idea of scalar collapse, that rather than doing kind of what you're hoping it can do in this kind of not productive, but kind of progressive or perhaps more climate aware kind of way, that it ends up doing exactly the opposite by collapsing all of these ideas on top of each other? Sorry, lots of, yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, this idea for me of the scalar collapse, because when I read the reviews of Yanagihara, I think you get a real sense of that where the novel has been responded to negatively, there's a sense in which that attempt to put together the intimate and the large scale in such an ambitious way just ends in everything kind of collapsing in on itself. And perhaps there is some truth in that, but I think there is also a utopian project at work that is suggesting that needn't necessarily be the case, and that actually that there is a possibility there for the, what we call simultaneity or multiplicity or envelopment. So I think that's what we are seeing in these novels, is something that resists some of that disjunction or tension, particularly as that's been theorized by some of the other postmodernisms, this idea that there's a kind of oscillation that's always at work, or a tension. Whereas I think a lot of the novels that we're looking at are trying to think through that to what might be an alternative way of thinking about it, that is about co-inhabitancy and how the novel might realize that. As I said, even if that is a kind of utopian form, it's really telling into Paradise that all of the sections of the book end before you know what happens. So very implicit within it is the sense that in which this isn't a realized project, that it's actually very self-consciously saying that this is something that is yet to be realized. And there's a question even within Yanagihara's own writing about whether that
will pay dividends or not.
Did you want to add anything, Kristian?
Yeah, just to build on that very idea. Yeah, absolutely. I think that you know, the whole point of literature is that it holds that kind of, as to use your term, that kind of ethical political potential, and it holds that kind of anticipatory power. It has that kind of anticipatory logic behind it, and it gestures to something that exists almost at the threshold of the understanding. And so literature can get away with collapsing those ideas of scale and still make it quite progressive in ways that might not be applicable to kind of real world situations often, but it's gesturing to something. And yeah, I think the term that we often use for that is, we use that term envelopment. And envelopment means this kind of, I suppose it does involve an almost collapsing of scale, but often in literature, the text that we've identified, that kind of connection between the intimate and the large scale, kind of personal or planetary, it tends to have quite a progressive function. And I remember we did I can't say how useful this might be for other disciplines, but we did a keynote a couple of months ago in Germany, I think it was, and there was quite a few people from kind of media and film and even practice-based subjects in the creative arts going, oh yeah, that's what we're seeing in the text that we're doing as well. So I mean, I'm clueless about all of this. I don't know if that's true or not, but they seem to think that the idea of envelopment and a kind of deep simultaneity is something that we're seeing across other cultural forms as well, in trying to reconcile that scale of disjunctiveness we've been talking about.
And so when you say envelopment, so is that different to embeddedness for you, or are these? Did I misunderstand it? I think you said embeddedness in Roy. So is that different to envelopedness, or what's
Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, the embeddedness is a quotation. So if I were to write that paper, I'd use the word envelopment. I don't think they're not different for me, but the author of that paper has chosen a different terminology for that. But I think what's interesting is that, for me, that, you know, that's an example of where that broader planetary thinking around literature, and particularly around world literatures, is really crucial to this as a perspective. This is not something that can be pulled out of Anglo-American writing. And I think where postmodernisms are looking there, then they are seeing perhaps a disjunction. But I think if you look more widely at what's going on, it's a slightly different canvas.
Yeah, I see. Because with the envelopment, it kind of makes me also think of the sort of phenomenology of reading. Certainly with A Little Life, it's such an intense book. You sit there with it for like 6 weeks or something. I don't know how long it takes you. You're really enveloped. Whereas I suppose embedding, I was thinking of a kind of Russian doll of scale. Wasn't this the thing that DiCalio and Horton talk about the way it's the same object that we're looking at in different ways, and these things need to be looked at not as separate, but sort of as the same object ontologically or epistemologically. But yeah. So,
and I was just going to say, we've been asked this question before about the reading and about the transglossic as a reading practice, and that wasn't something we'd initially thought about so much, but now we have thought about, and it is really interesting because I love Yanagihara's prose. I love it in A Little Life. It's part of what I'm immersed in. And then I'm aware that other people really just hate it. It's been described as the worst kind of fan fiction prose, and so there is something really interesting there, I think, about a particular kind of prose that's evolving in relation to these questions, which also is, I think, something about what you're saying about how this also involves form and that relationship between form and a particular kind of perspective.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, go for it. Yeah. I've got a question for you as well afterwards. So.
Okay, great. So, Sarah, you mentioned the subjectivity of the reader in the response, and I think both in scale and ethics, reader can be influential. So ethics, you could say that the story world functions in a vacuum, but if you consider morality from the perspective of like moral psychology and identification, then reader is important. And also scale, like you mentioned, Tim Morton's, like the relation to future peoples. And so the novelist can construct a sort of relationship between characters, but there's also a relationship between the reader and those characters. So where do you think the role of the reader comes in transglossic literature?
It's really interesting. Ruth Ozeki's book, the book of can't remember what it's called. That's just won the women's
Form and
prize.
Emptiness, I
The
think.
Book of Form and Emptiness. That's it, Kristian. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. She's been talking about that book, and she's been saying, you know, this book only works if it's a dialogue between the reader and the writer. That it doesn't function without that relationship. And I think you're absolutely right, Yazdan. I think these books are also inviting a particular kind of dialogic relationship. The other great example of this is Ali Smith, who in her seasonal quartet is just doing this all the time. She's doing fascinating things with scale. We could have talked about her as well if we had more time. But what she's also doing is this continual address of the reader to try and encourage that kind of relationship.
Yeah, so I had you a question for Yazdan. Again, for people listening, if you've got a question, please chuck those in the Q&A box. When you were giving your paper, I felt like there were lots of kind of, to me, implicit links with different aspects of genre theory. Particularly, you know, you sort of discuss this idea of like logical types. You at the end of the weak theory, it made me think of the way in genre theorists often talk about like fuzzy boundaries and fuzzy concepts, and that genre is a fuzzy concept, and that genre, when you look at everything that's in there, you know, you go down to the sort of iconographic, and you know, people. So I'm from film studies, so people looking at westerns, they're looking at, you know, the boots and the exact kind of doors that you have to, and what the sheriff's hat's wearing, but all the way up to how sort of nation, if you talk about British cinema, or you talk about world literature or art cinema, you have these whole different kind of scales, in a sense, of genres, and within those you have subgenres, and you can be part of multiple genres, subgenres, and depending on who you're talking to, that those genres mean different things to different people. So I was wondering whether there's any connections or sort of productive interconnections between genre theory and the way you're trying to conceive of scale within literature and literature methodologies.
There certainly is a connection. I'm not sure if it's a productive one. So for example, Amitav Ghosh, his whole book is about the serious novel. And so he attests to the fact that science fiction or many genre fictions have managed to discuss climate change. But the particular problem of the scale of climate change is in serious novel, which we're used to the sort of bourgeois novel, which is about the everyday life and normal events and so on. But I'm not sure if the sort of top-down demands that we should bring scale and climate change into this specific kind of work that we see as highbrow is productive. You could argue that if we're just scaling up, then we need to have climate change in every kind of genre and then aggregate it, and then we could achieve something. But I'm not sure if that's a top-down view. I think it naturally emerges, and most of the instances when an author feels like they have to write about climate change in a certain way, Ian McEwan's Solar, for example, they don't end up that good. Well, right now, there is such an abundance of climate fiction that in various different genres in aggregate, we have, I think, achieved some sort of trans-scalarity.
Mm-hmm. And do you think there's, perhaps on the scale question, there's also something about the sort of, not just the discourse, but then the impact that has. I was watching something recently where Kim Stanley Robinson, I forgot who exactly mentioned him, but where he was saying that he got invited after writing The Ministry for the Future. He got invited to some of the big talks. I think it was at Davos or at COP, I forget exactly what. And so he was in the room with people who actually had serious power in relation to making decisions about climate change. And this all stemmed from his writing of this particular book. So this is going to be, you asked for a comment rather than a question. So do you think there's something there that fits in with scale? I don't know how to phrase that as a question.
It is what Weichi Dimmock says, unexpected solutions from unexpected corridors. Some solutions may come from fiction. And this is why with climate change, the scale is so big that we need everything. I might not particularly like Kim Stanley Robinson's novel, but it is a solution and it might work. Let's have it.
Okay, yeah. And perhaps a final question before we close up to perhaps to all three of you. It comes from Yazdan, where you talked about this issue with avoiding the problem by framing the problem, or by framing the solution as a kind of unsolved or a non-solution, and whether there's lots of literature, whether it be the critiques of Yanagihara, and where Sara, you're saying, you know, there's this thing of she always leaves the stories open and sort of never gets to the end of them, or these methodological solutions that Yazdan, you're talking about, which effectively avoid having a solution by making that solution a non-solution or a fuzzy solution, or some kind of I don't know, could call it a kind of postmodern sort of, we're just going to blur all the boundaries, and so that we'll just leave it with that blurriness, and we enjoy that. So I suppose my question is, what do you think about this? How do you see that? What and how does that sort of perhaps link with what you've just talked about now?
To be honest, I'm just uneasy about it.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't think that should be our first solution. We shouldn't be complacent with the fact that this is just the interpretive methodology that we have. We're going to stick with it, and if we can't work with it, then we change the question rather than the solution.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if there is anything we could do.
Very pithy. Kristian, you seem like you wanted to jump in on that.
Yeah, I think with regards to the field of literature specifically, all I can say is that that kind of fuzziness that you mentioned, and the way it's operating in certain texts now, isn't the same way it operates in texts of the 60s, 70s, 80s, where you'd have this kind of postmodern fuzziness, and you'd have these narrative threads left unresolved. Even if it was a Russian doll structure, they'd still be left unresolved, and it would be without any kind of ethico-political meaning, as we mentioned earlier. And while we still have those structures, and there's still a fuzziness, the way the texts are working is not the same way you'd find in a kind of a Thomas Pynchon novel, for example. What we're finding in things like Yanagihara is a gesture to something, which is an engagement with either the social, cultural, political, ethnic realities of the 21st century, which are obviously using some elements of what we might call postmodern, but certainly what we're finding is a more ethical basis, not just through the content or the form, but by the role of the author as a public intellectual. And we're seeing that more and more in a way we didn't see with the slightly more apolitical aspects of postmodernism of the late 20th century. So that fuzziness still exists, but it takes on a whole new relevance in a very different way. So yeah, Sarah, you want to build it?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say quickly that I think you're absolutely right. And I think in all of these novels, what you see uncertainty, but then what you see ultimately are characters who have to take a position and who recognize that they have to take a position. And I think they have to take a position because choice itself is a privilege. So Yanagihara has talked about this, the way in which she sees, the notion of choice itself as something that is not universally available. And once you recognize that, then you have to make a choice. And so even though the outcome is unclear, because the outcome could be 30,000 years in the future, that's the nature of the unfolding environmental crisis, you still have to take a position and you have to make a choice. So fuzziness is only a phase in what ultimately becomes the recognition that you have to make some kind of choice and take a stand in one way or another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see. Yeah, Zachary Horton actually has jumped in with something. So he says, is it possible that the novel as a form just naturally addresses the individualist scale, kind of addressing this discussion, and strains under the weight of transscalar dynamics or subjects beyond their internalization by individual protagonists in representation? So if so, can the novel be productively broken for the 21st century? And he continues, and that literary criticism is gesturing towards the transscalar, but continually running into this wall, i.e. pushing literature further than it wants to go or beyond its richest affordances, which might perhaps be what Yazdan would. You can see this question if you click on the question thing. But does that speak to any of you? Can it be productively broken, the novel, for the 21st century?
Yes, I mean, I think there are certain texts where that's certainly the case, and yeah, as I mentioned earlier, there's certainly a case where in certain novels, we're not seeing I think earlier I said a failure of scale. It's probably more of a failure of managing scale, as kind of Zachary is alluding to there. And what we're seeing by authors is this active attempt to acknowledge scale, and even in the act of acknowledging it, it's pushing in that direction away from those kind of modernist suffixes and that kind of recursive patterning that the novel always used to fall into. Instead, we're seeing an active attempt to kind of not break the novel, but rewrite the purposes of the novel form and the author as an intellectual and what it can achieve, I think.
Great. Do you want to jump in? If not, yeah, no problem.
I think we can't answer that yet because of the role of the reader. So it is true that the novel is naturally good at individualist scale, but when it goes above that, first there's discussion that does the novel have scale and can it have scale? But if it does, the role of the reader is important because the reader can interpret any other scale on an individual scale. And that is what empirical eco-critics are trying to find out. And so it is not just the question of literary criticism and what it wants. And then there is also the fact that what interpretive methodologies do is that they focus on meaning, ambivalence, defamiliarization, things that other disciplines that study novels, like environmental communications, aren't concerned with. So there could be novels that try to break scale, break the novel to achieve other scales. But does it also push them out of the purview of meaning, ambivalence, and things that literary criticism is concerned with? I don't know.
Do you have a final word, Sarah, or?
No, I mean, I think just to agree with what's been said, I think one of the questions we face a lot is, well, you know, why still the novel? You know, because there's been a massive expansion in other, particularly, you know, lyrical non-fiction forms, autofiction, these kinds of writings that are also asking a lot of these same questions and attempting to think about the relationship between the large scale and the personal. But I think the novel, because of its imaginative potential and that potential of narrative, you know, which Yazdan, you were gesturing towards, how narrative functions in this, I think means that it still does have that potential. And whether or not ultimately we can break it, I agree with Yazdan, I don't think we know yet, but I think we know that people are trying, and I think that in itself is something to be excited about.
What a great way to finish. So please accept my thanks once again, Yazdan, Sara, and Kristian, for 2 great papers. And thank you for your volleying back and forth with these questions. Thank you to our audience for listening in. I thought it was really, really interesting. Now we're going to go on to, in about 45 minutes, Joshua DiCalio will be giving his keynote. So please join us then for that. But for now, thank you very much. Goodbye to everybody and good night.